Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Black History Commission of Arkansas and the Arkansas State Archives' first virtual symposium. We are so happy that you all could join us this morning. You could have been anywhere else doing anything else, but you chose to sit in front of your phone or your computer and learn a little bit more about African American history in the state of Arkansas. Just a few house rules. We're going to ask everybody to please stay on mute. If you have questions for the speaker, then I will need for you to type it in the box, and I will, at the end of their presentation, I will ask the questions for them and they can respond to the questions in the order in which they were received. If you have any questions, I will be monitoring the chat box and I can answer them via chat. But thank you again for joining us. And I will turn it over now to Carla Coleman, who is the chair of the Black History Commission of Arkansas.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction, Tiana. As she said, my name is Carla Hines Coleman, chair of the Black History Commission. And I want to welcome each and every one of you. I ditto what Tiana said. Give you a little history of the Black History Commission of Arkansas. It was formed and established by Act 1233 of 1991, and it was created and composed of 7 appointed members by the governor of Arkansas. We have quarterly meetings, and the Black History Commission provides directions, gathering African-American historical material for the Arkansas State Archives through the collecting and documents and other objects, offering grants, and the grant is the Curtis Sykes Memorial Grant Fund, and the Black History Commission of Arkansas ensures African-American history and culture, that it is preserved for future generations. The board members are Dr. Jessie Hargrove, who is the vice chair, Dr. Cherisse Jones-Branch of Jonesboro, Elise Hampton of Conway, Pat Finley Johnson of Pocahontas, and Reverend Ricky Lattimore of McGee. There is also, I want everybody to look up Act 326 of 1991, which was established that African-American history be taught in Arkansas schools. So make sure you check that out. So I will turn it back over to my board members.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jessie Hargrove. I'm a commissioner appointed by the governor, and I work at Philadelphia Smith College in Little Rock.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Cherisse Jones-Branch. I'm a commissioner also appointed by the governor, and I teach at Arkansas State University.
Well, I think those are the only commissioners that are on right now. So I'll turn it over to our wonderful director and state historian of the Arkansas State Archives, Dr. David Ware, for his comments today.
Okay, flattery will get you everywhere, T. Good morning, everybody. My name is David Ware, and I usually introduce myself as being state historian and incidentally director of the Arkansas State Archives. I've had the honor of having this job for just on 1 year, so I'm still the new kid, at least in this office, although for the 19 years previous, I was the historian of the state capitol. And so the state archives, or as it was when I first came to work here, the Arkansas History Commission, was effectively my home away from home. I am delighted to be part of this symposium, delighted and honored, because one of my jobs, in addition to being the one who washes the dishes at the end of the day around here, is I get to serve as the ex officio secretary of the Black History Commission of Arkansas. As such, this is a practical connection between the state archives and the Black History Commission of Arkansas that I think is very important. When the Arkansas State Archives was first organized as the Arkansas History Commission back in 1905, given its own home in the new state capitol in 1911, African American history was kind of an afterthought. And I think it's safe and fair to say that the organizers of the Arkansas History Commission back a century or more ago didn't really think of Black history as something other than the history of the white population of Arkansas, how they developed it. Oh yes, there were African Americans there. They were slaves and then they were free. And then let's get on to talking about the movers and shakers, the planters and the bankers and so forth. Well, it wasn't good enough for a century ago, but it's what went. It's not that way anymore. Since 1991, the Black History Commission of Arkansas has been a voice for nudging the state archives, encouraging us and helping us find more African American related material. Today, we have an unparalleled collection of Arkansas related materials, including I think the largest extant collection of Arkansas journalism, including runs of several African American owned and edited newspapers here. We are a superb genealogical resource as well. And we're not resting on our laurels. We're constantly looking for new collections, new ways to expand the understanding of Arkansas's past and make it not just the history of one racial group, but the history of all racial groups, all cultural groups, how they work together to turn out the Arkansas that we have today and the Arkansas towards which we are all headed. So at any rate, thank you for attending this morning. The theme, migration, it's one that unites all peoples, all nations. It's especially applicable to Arkansas and the African American communities here. I am going to, at this point, simply sit back, turn off my camera, and I'm going to listen and I'm going to learn. Thank you all for attending.
Okay, Cherisse.
Good morning. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kenneth Barnes. The title of his talk is Arkansas's African Migration Movement in the Late 1800s. Dr. Barnes is a professor of history at the University of Central Arkansas, UCA. He received his BA from UCA, MA from the University of East Anglia in England, and his PhD from Duke University. He has taught at Concordia University in Chicago and the University of Southern Mississippi before returning to UCA as a professor in 1993. He served as chair of the UCA Department of History for 10 years. He is the author of several books and articles on German history and Arkansas history, including Who Killed John Clayton? Political Violence and the Emergence of the New South, which was published by Duke University Press in 1998, Journey of Hope, the Back to Africa Movement in Arkansas in the Late 1800s, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2004, and Anti-Catholicism in Arkansas, How Politicians, the Press, the Klan, and Religious Leaders Imagined an Enemy, 1910 to 1960, published by the University of Arkansas Press in 2017. His newest book, The Ku Klux Klan in 1920s Arkansas, How Protestant White Nationalism Came to Rule a State, will be published by the University of Arkansas Press in April. Welcome, Dr. Barnes.
Thanks very much, Cherisse, for the introduction, and thanks to the History Commission, Black History Commission, and State Archives for putting this event on today. I'm so glad to see a good number of people coming out on a Saturday morning in Super Bowl weekend for a historical event like this. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint that I'm going to use. Okay, you see my title there. I'm just going to jump right in, and I want you to imagine a scene that was unfolding on March 10th of 1892 in this location of this very nice watercolor. There was a Dutch steamer called the Werkendam that was coming into the harbor in New York City, loaded with 569 passengers after a two-week voyage from Rotterdam. And I just want you to imagine passengers crowding the deck, probably speaking a variety of languages like Polish, German, Yiddish, mostly from Central and Eastern European countries, as they were passing by this Statue of Liberty on their way into Ellis Island that had just opened up 2 weeks prior. Well, as they were making this trip into New York Harbor, they would have passed an old-fashioned sailing ship called the Liberia. that was packed literally to the rafters with families from Morrilton, Arkansas, who were leaving on their way to Africa. I want you just to ponder the irony of that scene for a minute. Just that, you know, the one story is the classic American story about people who are leaving a homeland, taking a big risk to go to a new world because of political oppression that they were fleeing or the pull of economic opportunity that they wish they would find there. Well, that's the familiar American story, almost an iconic one. But the other story of this group of people fleeing the American South for exactly the same reasons, fleeing oppression and also hoping that things would be better on the other side. That's, I think, less part of the general story that we understand about migration, but it connects considerably here with the state of Arkansas. I want to make the point that after 1865, after freedom, moving, relocating for Black people was an act, an expression of freedom itself. The idea that you could get up and move wherever you want to go was an expression of their freedom, just like marrying the person of your choice. And so there's going to be quite a bit of mobility among Black people after 1865. In fact, in the 1870s, Arkansas was a destination that Black Americans were coming to from other states in the Deep South. In fact, Arkansas was gaining population in the 1870s, more so than any other southern state, a Black population, because land was cheaper, wages were higher, and then there was a perception that there was more opportunity for Black people in Arkansas than elsewhere in the South. Reconstruction ended in Arkansas in 1874, but when it did, the Democrats who took over state government in that year didn't really take away the newly won voting rights of Black men. And they not only voted in good number, but they also actually ran for office and won office in quite a number of counties in the Black majority counties in the Delta region. Well, that situation changed a bit after the 1876 election. That presidential election in 1876, along with the one we just had in November, are the two most contested elections in American history. And it officially ended Reconstruction in the last state, South Carolina and Los Angeles, where federal troops were still located to enforce Reconstruction. And immediately in those states, white Democrats began to clamp down on Black voters. Well, in Arkansas, that didn't really happen on a state level, but in the Black majority counties in the Delta, a good number of white Democrats were determined to take back control over the courthouses. And this was especially true in Phillips County with its county seat, Helena.
This is the first time I've ever tried to watch Zoom.
In Phillips County, in fact, here's a little cartoon from the 1876 election that's kind of describing the kind of election engineering that was happening in that election. And I think that would be kind of typical for quite a number of the elections where Black voters, when they attempted to vote, were just literally manhandled and prevented from voting. In Phillips County, Black Republicans held all the county offices, including the senator to the General Assembly. His name was Anthony Stanford. I'll have a picture of him in a moment. And the representative, Barry Coleman, and then all the other offices too. Well, white Democrats in the next election coming up in September 1878, they formed a militia company of about 1,000 men who wore red shirts. They called themselves the Red Shirts. They paraded around Black neighborhoods in Phillips County to intimidate would-be Black voters. The leader of the group went to Memphis and got 2 cannon, one which he positioned at the courthouse in Helena, and the other one they dragged around rural precincts where Black voters might want to vote to just simply make a point. The county sheriff and the county clerk actually went to Little Rock to try to talk the governor into sending a militia to counter this white militia, but he refused to do that. On election day in September, literally this white militia group, paramilitary organization, literally corralled Black people into pens under the pretext of quarantine because it was 1878 when the yellow fever epidemic was raging in that area. And no surprise then that white Democrats won all of the office offices in a county that had gone Republican with Black votes and with Black office holders in the previous election. That same kind of procedure took place again in 1880. In the next state election, it was even more extreme. There were, in fact, only 10 Republican votes cast in Phillips County that had 15,000 Black residents. In neighboring Lee County, there was only one Republican vote. And in Crittenden County, also a Black majority county, there were actually none, even though, of course, you know, there were many Black men who had been voting there a Republican in previous elections. Well, with that kind of situation in 1878 and 1880, Black people in Phillips County and other neighboring Delta counties began to organize a migration movement. I want you to think about migration in general. I think what we'll hear about it today, and this would be in general, was an act of resistance. It's an act of people saying, we're going to do something to change the status quo. We're not going to take it anymore. Violence could be an act of resistance, but migration could as well. In Phillips County, this migration movement pinned its hopes on Liberia in West Africa. Liberia had been founded back in the 1820s as a colony for freed slaves from the United States, founded by a philanthropic organization called the American Colonization Society. That's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm going to hereafter call it the ACS. And they raised money to send people of color back to Africa. A couple of decades later, in the 1840s, the ACS actually sponsored the declaration of Liberia as an independent Black republic with a constitution and a flag that was actually modeled after that of the United States. The capital of Liberia was Monrovia, named after President James Monroe, who was president when that colony had been founded there. And before the Civil War, the ACS had assisted some 13,000 migrants in getting back to Africa, although you might recognize that it's not for sure that Liberia would be the exact location where these people of color, where their ancestors had been taken from into slavery to the United States. But it's in the neighborhood, it's sort of in the heart of the area where a great number of slave trading activities had taken place. After the Civil War and after emancipation, the activities of the ACS actually declined because one might think, why would these people of color be wanting to go back to Africa? They scaled down their activities. In fact, it had become by the 1870s and 1880s basically a one-man show. A general secretary who was the staff person for this office, using his daughter often as his secretary, from an office on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. His name was William Coppinger. Well, in the context of the late 70s, as the folks in Phillips County get interested in going to Liberia, here's just a nice watercolor of what Liberia would have looked like, maybe a bit cleaned up perception of it around the time. You might have a look at this. I'm kind of rushing to make sure I get through my talk, so I'll go on. Okay. In November of 1877, already there was an organized Back to Africa movement in Helena, organized by this man, Dr. Anthony Stanford, who was the elected senator for Phillips County. And he called this meeting, and there were about 100 who attended at one of the Black Baptist churches in Helena. And they made plans for how they might actually plan of mass migration to Liberia. After that meeting, he and some others were in contact with the American Colonization Society. And in the following year, actually after that 1878 election, in the spring of 1879, 5 families from Phillips County and Dr. Stanford and his wife and son actually traveled, were accepted as immigrants by the ACS and were taken to Liberia. Well, the fact that some of them actually made it to Liberia whipped up excitement in Phillips County. And in the following year, there was so much excitement that a group of about 150 African Americans from Phillips left for New York City on their own without even being accepted as migrants by the ACS, and just simply arrived in New York City with no ship waiting to take them to Liberia, nobody expecting them, nobody ready to accommodate them. The office of the ACS, remember, was in Washington, D.C. William Coppinger made a quick trip up to New York to attend to these folks. When they arrived in New York, they literally just walked up 6th Avenue until they found a room that could accommodate them in the colored YMCA in Midtown, where about 100 of them were sleeping crowded on a floor and lying on tables. As they called them in the New York newspapers, the Arkansas refugees stranded in New York. And they're going to stay there for 3 months until the ACS was able to raise enough money and even get a couple of ships lined up to take them onto Liberia. This really nice line drawing that you see here was published in a New York paper in 1880 of the Arkansas refugees. I love the picture. Well, this was the beginning of the Liberia Exodus movement in Arkansas, but just as it was getting going, actually things got better. The situation for Black people in Arkansas improved in the 1880s. I can't really explain it well. I'm not quite sure exactly why or how, but in the elections that followed the 1881, Black men began to vote again. And by most of the 80s in the Black majority counties in Arkansas, the Democrat and Republican officials kind of came up to an agreement to use a so-called fusion agreement where they would split the offices in the Black majority counties. The Democrats would get a couple of offices, Republicans would get to elect a couple more offices, and it was a workable compromise. And it resolved some of the political violence that had been so much a problem in the Delta counties in the late 1870s. And then in the 1880s, the immigration or migration to Arkansas resumed. In fact, the 1870s and 1880s will be the era when there's the largest percentage-wise growth of the Black population in Arkansas in its history. In fact, in some ways, I'll call it a golden age for Black Arkansans, the 1880s, when the population had risen to the level that there were Black institutions that began to operate, like, and in this picture, Arkansas Baptist College founded, Philander Smith College founded, Shorter College founded, Black business districts, just more of an infrastructure for Black life, particularly in towns in the Delta region and in Little Rock and places where there were larger Black populations. So things got better, and the migration movement didn't entirely stop. There were letters that trickled now and then between Arkansas to Washington, D.C. to the office of the ACS. But generally speaking, it declined through the 1880s until the end of the decade when things began to change. It's a pretty complicated process. The political changes that are going to motivate a new and much bigger Back to Africa movement in the late 1880s, but it had to do with the rise of an agrarian populist movement in Arkansas in the 1880s, where a group of poorer white farmers in the rural areas defected from their traditional loyalties with the Democratic Party and began to form a third party that went into an alliance with the Republican Party. And this sort of an alliance of really the poor, Black and white, was a remarkable thing when that happens, threatened really the hold that the white Democrats had over county governments in many parts of Arkansas and even the state level positions. And that's going to motivate violence and fraud. The 1888 and 1890 elections were extremely fraudulent, probably the most fraudulent in Arkansas history were those two. In fact, by now I've already talked about contested elections, fraudulent elections, and a pandemic. So maybe the more things change, the more they stay the same, at least in discussion, perception. But anyway, 1888, 1890, white Democrats tried various different methods to basically steal the votes of Black men to take them out as sort of the weakest link in this coalition of the rural poor so that they could take back power or not be challenged by them anymore. I'll just give you one example. In Plummerville, not far from where I'm sitting, white Democrats put masks on and at gunpoint literally stole the ballot box as they were counting it in the precinct that contained the largest number of the Black votes of Conway County. So things like that, really violent measures brought in 1890 a General Assembly to Little Rock that took as one of its first actions a symbolic gesture. They took down the picture of George Washington and put up one of Jefferson Davis. That General Assembly then went on to enact the disfranchisement laws, the so-called secret ballot law. I have a piece of it here from the Acts of Arkansas that would basically begin the process of disfranchising Black voters. And then while they were at it, went on to the second step, which was passing the beginnings of these Jim Crow laws that would enforce or create legal segregation of the races in the state of Arkansas. I have an example of one of those, the separate coach bill that was also passed by that legislature. So if you think about it, what they really are setting up is the beginning of this one-party, white control political system that's going to last in Arkansas until the civil rights movement in the 1960s will begin to undo that. So it's a really momentous event, and Black men and women understood what all of this meant. Not only were they taking away their hard-won rights and even the idea of equality as citizens, but it's going to unleash a wave of racial violence in the early 1890s. And if you think about it, it somewhat makes sense. If you can take away their rights, their votes, you can also take away their life. And there's going to be a wave of lynchings in 1892, 1893, like the one that's in this picture. I don't know exactly what the location of this is, but by the type of photograph, it can be dated to 1890s. I think one of these days somebody's going to tell me they recognize someone in this picture. But I could generalize that in the early 1890s, right after these electoral or legislative defeats, a Black person in Arkansas stood a greater chance of being lynched than in any other state in the United States. That's going to unleash really the what I call Liberia fever, as people became intensely interested, almost desperate to get out of Arkansas. And of course, what they're doing here is they're giving up on America. They're not just wanting to leave Arkansas or the South. They're giving up the idea that the federal government is going to protect them, and they're pinning their hopes on a place as far away from white people as they can get. There's a strong current of Black nationalism that's in this Back to Africa movement that's kind of resonant of Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, or Louis Farrakhan or Malcolm X in a much later period, where they're literally talking about not wanting equality or integration. They're wanting to get away from white people. And Liberia represented that, a place where they could have a government that's run by Black people in a land that constitutionally only people of color could even own land there. So there was just a wave of correspondence that comes from Arkansas, like this application form that you see here from Morrilton, a list and list of these that I uncovered in the records of the American Colonization Society that are in the Library of Congress, just sheet and sheet after another of these, filled with names of people from Arkansas who are applying to go to Liberia. There were thousands, literally thousands of letters, some of them quite eloquent, pleading their case, of people writing to Washington, to Pennsylvania Avenue, with the idea, if you can just understand what's the situation for me back in Arkansas, how threatened I am, what our life is like, surely you'll take me and my family as immigrants. Literally thousands of these letters were pouring into the ACS in the early 1890s. And this is kind of remarkable too, considering that the majority of Black men in Arkansas in 1890 census were illiterate. So they're getting often maybe preachers, teachers in their communities to write letters and fill out these forms sometimes for them. Also some mass meetings like this handbill that went up to announce meetings to organize people for Back to Africa activities, or another expression of it was clubs. There were at least 50 Back to Africa clubs organized in different communities. Sometimes they even disguised their intent with some kind of a fake name, perceiving that if they announced to the public, to the white public, that they were organizing to migrate to Liberia, then there would be retribution coming back on them. So they might call it the Working Men's Association or something rather than a Liberia Exodus Club. There was generally opposition to this in the white population because they wanted to keep their laborers on the plantation. They did not, it would create a labor shortage if mass migration of people from the cotton fields of Arkansas were heading off to Liberia. The map that you see here shows where in 1891 alone, the next year after when these disfranchisement laws and Jim Crow laws went on the books, where the letters were coming from, more than 800 letters arriving in Washington, D.C. from Arkansas alone, just in that 1 year, from the post offices that you see with the dots on this map. You can see where the greatest interest in Back to Africa was, and it's not actually that logical because some of the places that had the largest number of African Americans had less interest in migration, and some of the, like Conway County, Faulkner County, Pulaski County, Jackson County, where there were not Black majority counties, had intense interest. But the explanation I think I've been able to offer is in the areas where the political environment was most intense and contentious and violent were the areas where there was the greatest interest in migration to Liberia. Conway County was a sort of epicenter of that, probably the most active and interested, and will have the largest number of immigrants going to Liberia. Something like 20% of the Black population of that county applied to immigrate to Liberia. Okay, interest was probably at a peak in 1892, right on the scene, the moment that I talked about at the beginning of this talk. In February of 1892, this group of immigrants from Morrilton had been approved and were on their way to New York. But as they were on their way to New York to catch the ship, William Coppinger, the secretary of the ACS, died of pneumonia. And as I said, it was a one-man show. With him gone, it was a crisis. These people were arriving, nobody to really make the final arrangement for their departure from New York. The ACS really was in crisis. It didn't have anybody really to pick up the pieces. And then even on top of that, we had another situation very similar to that one of 1880, when the group of unauthorized immigrants had just left their homes and come on up to New York with the expectation somebody's going to take us to Liberia. A group from Woodruff County, from the McCrory, Arkansas area of Woodruff County, and then also another group from Muldrow, Oklahoma, which is just a couple of miles west of Fort Smith, just headed up to New York. So we had a group of something like 300 African Americans descending upon New York City, creating a crisis. It was actually a PR nightmare because the New York newspapers were all over this, and sort of blaming the ACS for whipping up people's interest in Liberia immigration and then failing to deliver. So what happened with that crisis, with the death of the secretary, is the board of the ACS got out of the immigration business. They met and decided to raise the new money to send that group of refugees in New York onto Liberia, but thereafter to stop this kind of community-wide or mass migration initiative, and instead thereafter to turn it into the just selecting a few highly skilled personnel like missionaries, pastors, and teachers, people who have particular skills, and send them individually to Africa. The people that you see in this picture are such a group from Arkansas who were sent by the ACS to Liberia in 1898. And actually, the older guy that's at the center of the picture was a professor at Philander Smith College in Little Rock, and the woman underneath him is his wife, and the two children are his. And then the younger men, one was one of his students who was also going as a missionary teacher, and his wife, and the other was going to run a newspaper, was a printer. The woman that's on the far left bottom corner was a recent graduate of the Arkansas Normal School in Pine Bluff, today's UAPB. And here she was going off to, again, be a school teacher in Liberia. So that's really the turn that the ACS went to send people like these. And notice how well dressed and prosperous they are. They stopped in New York on their way to Liberia and posed for this picture, which is, I think, just a wonderful picture. So basically, the ACS is abandoning these plantation sharecroppers and workers in Arkansas, the ordinary folks who were so desperate to head to Liberia, and left them really in a lurch. Some of them, in desperation, began a movement to migrate to Oklahoma. In fact, in 1892, 1893, there was this kind of crazy idea, it seems from retrospect, that they could perhaps found a number of all Black towns in Oklahoma where people could live together, have a Black government, Black businesses, and again, not ever have to encounter white people. Again, it shows the depth of the violence and difficulties that would be the aspiration. Go someplace where they can be entirely separated from white folks. And there were a couple of dozen of such all Black towns founded in Oklahoma at this time. And a few of them have survived to this day. I think the largest are Boley and Red Hill or Red something. Can't remember the name of that second one. And even they talked about the idea that maybe Oklahoma could become an all Black state. Just to remind you that Oklahoma at this time was two territories, Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory. So it was subject more to federal law rather than Southern state legislatures that would institute Jim Crow. So they knew things would be better for them there. Another response was to the kind of demand or interest that people throughout the South, and particularly in Arkansas, had for immigration, was some white businessmen started a company that they thought could profit over people's desperation or aspiration to immigrate. It was called the International Migration Society. And they set up a system that was kind of like a prescription system, subscription system, where Black families could send in so much money, like $1 a month, into a fund of this company. And when they reached a total of $40 per person, then they could get passage to Liberia. Actually, the company expected to make its money on forfeitures, because if you sent in $10 or $20 but never made it to 40, then you just lost what you had sent in. It actually cost more like $80 to send a person to Liberia. So they would take a loss for the actual ones that they sent, but thought they would make it up from those who didn't go but contributed. Well, this International Migration Society will actually send 3 groups of migrants to Liberia. The first group in 1894, which had had 14 people in it, that they got passage on ships by way of Europe, I think Liverpool, England, to Liberia. Half of those 14 were from Arkansas. And then in the next year, they had enough that had reached the $40 point that they actually chartered a ship, a steamship, that left from Savannah with 211 passengers bound for Liberia. Half of that ship, it's called the Horsa, that left Savannah in March of 1895, were from Arkansas, actually from Jefferson County. And I guess those would be the ones you see on the ship there, as a crowd from Savannah gathered to see them off. This group is actually the only group, the maybe 100 odd folks from Jefferson County that left of the 600 that I know that immigrated to Liberia in these years. It's the only group that I don't know their names. Because this wasn't done through the ACS, which kept good records of the persons. But I know I was able to estimate the size of the group, and they were identified as being from Jefferson County. The following year, there was another, this time 301 passengers that left from Savannah again on a ship that was chartered by the International Migration Society. This ship with the 301 passengers, again, about half of them were from Arkansas, the other half from other southern states, and then just a sprinkling from some outside of the South. I think it's a measure of how Arkansas was really the epicenter of the Liberia immigration movement in the 1880s and 1890s, to be that the largest number of immigrants of all the states going to Liberia were from Arkansas, a state which had relatively a smaller Black population than several others like Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and so forth. I do know the names of these passengers, except the names of the children, because they were listed in a newspaper that was published in 1896. Okay, the Lorata, as it left for Liberia, also took along a photographer, a white man, who went along with his camera and took pictures. So we have some really great pictures like this one, passengers on the Lorata at sea, sending a passenger who died to their final rest. 3 people died in that month-long voyage, but 2 babies were born in the meantime, so they had a net decline of 1 person. Here's another photograph of the Lorata passengers. I'm not sure if these ones, particularly like the lady with the white dress there, were actually the Arkansas ones, but there's a 50-50 chance that she was, as they're, imagine it, putting their first steps on African soil. It would be an emotional moment for them as they arrive. Well, a little bit about what happened to these folks once they get to Liberia. In the 1890s, here's a photograph of Liberia in the mid-1890s. One of the things that will impact their life is that the Liberian government welcomed them, and in fact would give each family 25 acres of land. If you were single, you'd get a 10-acre plot. This survey that was drawn up of a new town that was being set up basically for the Arkansas immigrants, called Johnsonville, shows the plots that were designated per person and per family. And there's a typo when they wrote Johnsonville, it became Bonsonville. And also notice one of the larger plots was for Gay Dulce alias Lewis Moore, a native chief. So they would be kind of in close proximity to some native peoples there in Johnsonville. And also just have a look at the kind of landscape that they encountered and think about what their challenges would be. They weren't generally being settled in Monrovia, the capital, or in town, but out in these in the countryside, in these acreage that's being set aside for them, but most of it's uncleared. So there'd be a lot of work to do at the very beginning of when they arrived, to clear the land, to be able to plow it, to get some crops in the soil. They were given about a 6-month supply of food and some essential supplies from the ACS and then the IMS a little bit later, but they had to be able to sustain themselves when those food stocks would run out. One of the first things they had to do was to establish shelter for themselves, and they usually built thatched cottages, like you see I took this picture in Liberia myself of the kind of dwellings that they were living in until they could build something more substantial, a home. This was a settler's cottage after they were able to build it in a more permanent dwelling. So just to get things set up for themselves for their new life would be one of the great challenges. But another one would be the ecosystem of Liberia. Coastal Liberia is one of the wettest areas of Africa, and there are all kinds of challenges of diseases that these Arkansas migrants had limited exposure to. One of them was malaria. There was malaria in Arkansas at this time, but it wasn't the deadly type of malaria that's endemic to West Africa. And truly, the settlers, as they were doing the hardest work to clear ground, to build houses, also were fighting the worst time in terms of the disease issues. Malaria just knocks you off your feet. And in West Africa today, where it's still endemic, it reduces people's work that they can perform substantially just simply because they're so weakened by it for long periods of time that they can't work. And that was a true challenge for the Arkansas migrants in the year they were there. They also had issues of getting along with the natives. This was kind of a love-hate relationship. There's some evidence that the natives taught them how to do things like plant certain kinds of African foods, which would be a challenge because the regular foods that they were used to eating in Arkansas just didn't grow well in Liberia, like corn, and they had to switch diets to things that were quite unfamiliar to them, and often the natives taught them how to do it, how to plant it, how to prepare it. But then there are also problems too. I know some of the Arkansas migrants to Johnsonville that from that survey before had ran into conflict with the natives over hunting because they brought their guns, their Winchester rifles from Arkansas, and wanted to hunt game, and that put them into some conflict with the native peoples. Some people didn't like it. There were, from almost every expedition, every group of Arkansas settlers, some returned to Arkansas, like this fellow from Forest City, who stayed about a year, and then he went back home and even took up the same place he had been where he was before. And this is a picture of him in his house in Forest City. But most stayed. If you could survive that first year, it's like they even called it seasoning. You're likely to not be so sick thereafter. And once, people began to acquire foodstuffs, they planted coffee was a major item that they thought could be a cash crop instead of cotton that they had back home. But it takes several years for those coffee saplings to turn into bushes and then to bear fruit. But if they could wait it out until the coffee started producing, that they could have some of a cash economy. So people tended to like it the longer that they would stay. I found this man when I went to Liberia to kind of sort out what's the story of the folks after they arrived in Africa. I found descendants of the Arkansas immigrants like this man who talked about how his family liked it and wanted to stay, or this one from the Phillips County, one of the earlier groups. His father had immigrated from Phillips County in 1880. And as a very old man, I found him when I was in Liberia a bit more than 20 years ago to do the research for this book. Also, I wanted to do a little shout out before I'm done here, and I can save some time for some questions, to the Black History Commission for giving me a grant that I used to go to New York to do some research for this section of my book, a chapter that's about the missionaries. In fact, the people that were in that wonderful photograph, I went to the Schomburg Institute in the Center for Black Studies in Harlem in New York City to do some research on one set of missionaries, and another set, I read the mail of that professor from Philander Smith that's in the archives of the United Methodist Church that's at Drew University in New Jersey. But I did that courtesy of the Black History Commission grant that I received. So thank you for that. And I'll leave it at that. And just a little reminder that, as I said, movement was a sign of freedom, but migration's also a sign of, as I said, resistance. And it's describes people who are risk takers. These folks who packed it up to head off to another continent were truly taking a risk. Some of them liked it, some of them didn't, but we'll find many of their descendants there today. And I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay, I have 2 questions. So if you have a question, you have to put it in the chat box and I'll ask Dr. Barnes. The first question that was asked, is there a book or website I can research the Glanton and the Roddy plantations?
The plantations, where are the plantations you're talking about?
Oh, they are in Arkansas, Woodruff County. That's what they said.
Woodruff County. Okay, I don't know those plantations, but Woodruff County was indeed, I'd say Woodruff, Phillips, and Conway County were the atmospheres that were the most just on fire for Liberia immigration, and Woodruff especially in the 1890s, and Conway County in the 1890s, as Phillips was in the late 1870s. And so there's some really must be some remarkable circumstances afoot in Woodruff County. I didn't really get down to the level to be able to take apart what's going on that specifically in Woodruff County to motivate other than some of the, maybe more generalized political violence that got in the newspaper, but to the level of individual plantations, I just don't have that knowledge.
Okay, the next question was, are the descendants of immigrants considered American citizens?
They are not considered American citizens, but many of them would like to be. I did the research for this book back in 1998. I finished the research, and as I said, I had so much information about the people before they left Arkansas, because they were writing these detailed letters to the ACS, talking about themselves and their lives to try to convince the ACS to accept them as immigrants. But once they were accepted and they got on the train to go off to New York or the boat to go to Africa, they generally stopped writing letters. So I knew very little about them after they got to Liberia. So that's one reason that I went to Liberia to try to find descendants of them and to put that story together, mostly through oral testimony. But I did find a lot of them. I was able to find them because they were generally on the land, since they land endures. They were given these 25 acres or 10 acres, and I could go to these locations where I knew they had settled, these Arkansas folks, and just start asking around. Literally arrived and started knocking on doors, and one person would take me to another and another and another. And the time that I was going there was a time when Liberia had just come out of a horrendous civil war that had been going on for about 15 years. Half of the population of Liberia was displaced from their homes. Many of them had come back to their homes by the time I got there in the later 1990s, but there was still a hugely torn up environment where a tremendous poverty, like the likes of which I had never seen before. Liberia had been one of the more prosperous African countries before the Civil War of the 1980s and 1990s, but it was a basket case when I was there. It lacked a functioning mail system, electricity, water, just basically all the infrastructure that we would take for granted. And as such, people were desperate to get out of Liberia. And those who could claim American ancestry could get a privileged position in the queue, basically. And so actually one reason I was pretty successful in being able to find people to talk to me is that they came seeking me out because I had something that they needed, which was documentary evidence of their ancestor who had come from the United States to Liberia. They would have an easier time getting a visa if they could demonstrate that they were of American descent. One of the issues with the Civil War in Liberia, it was sort of a native issue, natives versus people of American descent. The American settlers, when they got to Liberia, didn't, in some ways, treated the indigenous African peoples kind of like they had been treated back in America. They didn't give them citizenship. They didn't really have anything to do with them. And there was this privileged position for those who had last names like Smith or Williams over people that were indigenous Africans. Well, the payback came in the 1980s. And so literally, the people of American descent could call for refugee status because they had been so vulnerable because of violence against them by people of more indigenous African descent. So I found myself strangely when I was in Liberia caught up in an immigration movement. Here I was studying one, and I was actually a participant in one, as so many of these folks were trying as hard as they could to be accepted to immigrate to the United States. That's a long answer to that question, but.
Okay, the next question was, how did you identify the descendants in Africa when you were there?
Okay, I had a list of their names for the most part, and I knew the ACS had settled the Arkansas people in two towns specifically that weren't that far from Monrovia. So when I got to Liberia, I hired a driver, a taxi driver who was like my companion. And we went to those two villages and I just started knocking on doors until I found somebody who knew a name that was on my list. And then I could tell them, oh, well, are you the descendant of so-and-so that's on my list? And, they were just like fascinated by my project. And because they had could learn also about their family history. And once I got the first connection with someone, they would take me to a neighbor, to another neighbor, someone else, the name that they recognized on the list. So I had a lot of success in those two towns. And then word got out in Monrovia that I was doing this project. I was on the radio there about it, and people started coming to the house. Sometimes I had like a waiting room of a doctor's office, people sitting there waiting to see me, to tell me their story. So I had just great luck and success at connecting with people once I got there.
Okay, the next question was, how much of an interest was there for immigration from Faulkner County?
Quite a bit. Actually, it was a little bit of a spillover from Conway County, but there was one family in Conway who left in the late 1880s that went to one of these Back to Africa meetings, and the guy got so excited that he had a little baby born the next month, and he named her Monrovia after the capital of Liberia. And he took his family there in the late 1880s. He's one of the first to go in that second wave of migration. I was able to find his granddaughter. His name was Johnny Johnson. And I was able to find, she came to the house in where I was staying in Monrovia. And I had a really nice visit with her and her brother about their grandfather who was from Conway. And here I was, coming from Conway. So that was kind of fun.
This next question is a two-part question. Are the ships manifest readily accessible for the ACS ships to Liberia? And then, has there been any large-scale attempts to connect the descendants of those who left to their family members on the unit?
Okay, those are great questions. I had a published list of the ACS passengers. I'm not sure that it's available on the internet, but it was published as a book. So I had that. I made a photocopy of it, so I have it in my personal possession. And I don't know if any other kind of internet-based site has that. I could provide it if somebody was looking for a particular name. And then the second question was, remind me again.
Has there been any large-scale attempts to connect the descendants of those who left to their family members?
No, not really. I had some people who were when I was in Liberia ask me, well, can you connect me with my family back in Arkansas? Of course, I think they had an ulterior motive that they were trying to get someone to sponsor them as an immigrant. So other than me doing that, I don't think there was any large scale. I did a little attempt for some of the people I got to know well, but I have had a few Liberians who've immigrated here to the United States read my book and then seek me out. I had a woman from Oklahoma and her husband who came for the weekend to Little Rock, and she was a descendant of one of the immigrants who'd left from Argenta, Arkansas. The person back in Liberia was telling me his grandmother had come from Argenta. And I knew when I heard him say Argenta, well, that really dates this migration as a story that's prior to when it became called North Little Rock. I knew it was the real deal. Well, anyway, one of his descendants found me in Arkansas, and I went with her to show her the street, where her mother lived. Her great-grandmother lived in Argenta, just across from the Clinton Library, actually, on the other side of the river. And it was really a fun weekend to connect with some people on this side who had the connections to the other side too.
There is somebody who wants a copy of that book. Could you put your email address in the chat so they can email
Sure.
you?
Be happy to. Okay.
I don't have any more questions. Was there any more questions that anyone had? You can put in the chat before we move on. What about DNA science?
Don't know anything about that. I'm sure if you did some of the DNA tests on this side, it could tell you if you had connections with a particular region of Africa in your DNA, but I would suspect that so few Liberians would have had DNA tests that it would be a slim chance that you could connect with people in Liberia, specifically people in Liberia. That's a guess.
We've had a lot of people in the comment section say this was excellent research. You did an awesome job. Thank you so much. Dr. Barnes, for all that you did on your research. They have learned so much. It was an excellent presentation. They appreciate all the hard work that you put in, and I'm just overwhelmed with all the knowledge that I learned just by sitting here listening to all the information. No more questions from the audience for Dr. Barnes before we move on to our next presenter. If y'all want to take a quick run to the bathroom or something before we get started, I can give you 5 minutes to do that and stretch your legs, because I know you've been sitting in these seats for a moment before we start with our next presenter. So